Hey guys, what is up? Unrested back again, and today we are covering why it sucks to live in the countryside of Japan. I remember when I very first started getting interested into moving to Japan, what I would start to do, because we didn't have like YouTube videos about it back then in early 2006 is when I started to really research it. I would read people's live journals or vlogs about living in Japan. And one I read was a girl who had pretty much gone to college only for Japanese to learn how to speak it fluently, became really great at the language. Went there for her first visit to like Tokyo to kind of get a knowledge of how to exchange the language and stuff like that, get used to speaking, come back, finish her study because there was kind of a sister program at a school out there. Then finally, after she finished college, she got a job, and it was actually working for Jet, with, if you don't know, is a really decent setup. They pay quite well. They have decent hours, and they even pay for your lodging. And their salaries are always much, much higher than what the average English teacher makes. So she had a great setup. And one thing they often choose to do, though, is put you out in the countryside because the JET program is really interested in showing Japanese students what a foreigner is like, what someone from a different country is like. And the people who need that the most are not people in inner city Tokyo that's ultra international. It's kids out in the countryside. So that's where they placed her. So she's got a good setup, a great deal. She speaks really good Japanese. And I read her blog about living there, and she more or less said, like, the hardest thing was just like starting to adapt to some of the dialect out in the countryside because it's slightly different than, city dialect and stuff like that. But she got around that, and she was doing pretty well. And I didn't keep up with it near the end. She had been writing for a full year straight, and you can do JET, I believe, now it's as long as 3 to 5 years. And the only reason I didn't follow up finishing the whole saga that she wrote about was because I was making my own move to Japan, and I didn't even have things like internet and stuff like that when I first got there. But I remember I got all set up. I got set up in Osaka, had my first Kiowa teaching job of English conversation, and when I finally had everything laid out, my computer connected, I was like, so what did she decide to do? Did she decide to keep going with JET, or did she decide to move into the city? And during this time, I had started to make my first YouTube videos, and I found her actually commenting on my video, and I was kind of shocked. I was surprised that she had followed me back. I had followed her on a written blog, and I had only barely made any YouTube videos yet. It was literally my first videos that had like no talking. It was just like music playing in the background and me showing shots of Japan. This is like the very birthplace of YouTube happening as I had moved there. And I remember she commented on there and she said, I see you're still there and it's getting close to a year. I've already moved back. I should have chosen the city. I couldn't handle the countryside. And she went into greater detail, and some of the stuff I'll talk about, what she went into greater detail about, as well as what I've talked to other people who've lived out in the countryside. My family actually has an apartment out in the countryside as well that we go to, usually to visit a couple times a year as just kind of like a reset. It's great for getting like a reset from the insane city life because let me tell you, you are always in a rush when you are living in Osaka or living in Tokyo. It is non-stop. So let's get into some of these things. Number one, your Japanese has to be great. All right, you're gonna go there and find zero English whatsoever. Now, it's sometimes hard to communicate in Osaka and not so bad in Tokyo, where you can kind of string together words that are English, then switch to Japanese, and kind of like make this patchwork sentence to get across what you're trying to say. And the average, anything from retail worker to restaurant or even person working as a station manager in the subway will pretty much figure out what you're saying because they've dealt with so many gaijin foreigners coming through, usually where they are at in an international sort of melting pot. And when you get to the countryside, not only are you going to have people who are mostly elderly and speaking Japanese that is elderly Japanese, because let me tell you, they use some terms I had never heard before. For example, calling a dictionary or a jisho a jibiki, which I had never heard that word before. calling like winter wear that you'd wear like kind of like heat tech or like long johns, I guess is the English equivalent, calling it a momohiki, which is like just never said at all unless you're someone's grandparent's grandparent. So there was words I would hear out there that would just be like, I've never heard this before. What the heck is that? And they'd be like, oh, it's like this really, really old word. Like if you've ever had someone call jeans dungarees, that's kind of the equivalent of what you run into quite a bit when you're out in rural Japan. So you need to go there with a decent level of Japanese, or go there expecting to learn a decent level of Japanese. Trying to force English on pretty much anybody out there in the countryside is just not going to work. And sometimes it's even like they don't even know borrow words that may be common with the city areas of Japan, but just super rare out in the countryside because there's just no use to it, or the modern aspect of that word is just not used whatsoever. Speaking of elderly Japanese, of old school Japanese words, elderly life is the biggest activity out there. Most of the people who live out in the countryside are elderly. A big problem right now is depopulation of rural towns because the job market is just not great out there, or the job market just pays so little that it's not worth living out there, and tons of towns are just being completely abandoned, especially island-based rural areas. And the only people left there are those with pretty much a wealth to live off of after years of work, having set up their life there, having fully paid off their house, getting a pension, and the equivalent to Social Security combined. They're sitting pretty, they're doing okay. But you as a foreigner, number one, your job options are limited, especially if you only speak English. You're most likely teaching English, and that's about it. And there's not things like tech jobs. There is the rare occasion, and there's actually even a visa that's called farming visa, where you can go there and work on a farm. But you yourself owning a farm, that would take quite a bit of years of work and getting really good at the Japanese language, and then also understanding land taxation involved, area boundaries, maybe buying an IKEA, which is like an abandoned area, and turning it into a farm. I mean, you'd really have to get sunken deep into Japanese life to be able to do it. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm not going to try and kill that dream. If that's what you want to do, go for it. But just realize you got to get in deep. And like I said, elderly activities are pretty much the only thing out there to do. So for example, really old school matsuris, it's like festivals that come around during different seasons, town hall get-togethers, I guess different open markets, farmers markets type things, and old style Japanese games like playing shogi, which is, that's not that bad. Mahjong, stuff like that. I mean, if you're into that, maybe that's the life for you. No nightlife. Yeah, you're not gonna be finding a lot to do for nightlife. Like, you might have one bar that you have to drive to in the middle of the night, which means you also need to get your driver's license, which in Japan, there's a zero tolerance for having any kind of alcohol level when driving back home. So you better make sure that bar has a place nearby you can stay at if you go to drink at it. There isn't any tolerance level at all. There's not even like the 0.8 like we have here in America. I think it's 0.08, sorry. I think 0.8 you'd be like dead. 0.08, there's nothing like that. It's just like as soon as, well, you know what? I shouldn't say that. It might not be the same in every prefecture. But I know in Osaka, like if you have 0.0 whatever, like it's, I think there is some natural level people have, but you go above that like natural level and you're losing your driver's license. And that is the thing. You have to get your driver's license. Getting your driver's license in Japan is a debacle. I have had many friends who've gotten it. I was never interested. Number one, because in general, Osaka has amazing public transportation. Your trains are always on time. They're very easy to understand, very easy to follow. They take you exactly where you want to go. There's rarely a delay. They're incredible. They're clean, they're safe, they're incredible. And if you're living in the countryside, that just doesn't exist. I remember the girl who had written the blog about her life there said the train that she had there was one train that ran there that would take her all the way out to the city if she wanted to. And it only came like 2 times a day, and there was like 4 hours in between each time it came out. And I remember one time when I went out to an area where some of our relatives lived on my wife's side of the family, when we got off the rural train station there, I was shocked to see they didn't even have a station manager. They just were on like the honor system that you paid to go through the gate. Like it was wild. It was like maybe a really old concrete platform in the middle of like the trees. It was crazy. It was very surreal, very, very Ghibli-esque if you've ever watched the Ghibli movies. It felt like I was about to take Neko Bus out to where they lived. Um, Isolation. Oof, isolation. Isolation is already a problem. You're going to be kidding yourself if you're going to tell yourself, oh, I'm not going to feel isolated when I go to Japan. I'm going to learn perfect Japanese. I'm going to find a bunch of Japanese friends. Everybody's going to love me. I'm going to talk to them about all the anime and manga I love. Okay, good luck. But isolation is a for real thing. You will feel isolated. It is sometimes very hard to connect with Japanese. They take a lot longer to make friendships, especially long-term friendships, especially the more deeper friendships we can sometimes make in Western countries simply by having conversations at work, hanging out on the weekends, maybe just going to a coffee shop. It takes much longer to build trust, and it's not that they think gaijin are evil or bad or anything. It's just there's a big cultural barrier. There's a big traditional barrier. Even things like making a simple joke or being sarcastic doesn't always work because number one, you didn't grow up on the same multimedia that that person did, and often just sarcasm doesn't work in Japan. I've made that mistake one too many times. Mark my words. Steer away from sarcasm unless you're very close with somebody. Um, and isolation is a for real thing. I think if I didn't have my family in Japan, I don't know if I would have made it, going on 16 years now. I think it would have really pushed me to come back just due to isolation alone. Luckily, I had the support of my family, my wife's side of the family. They're very nice. My wife is awesome. My kids are awesome. But at work, I mean, I rarely made friends at work. I have probably two friends still in Japan who are like close friends, but they're both gaijin. I wouldn't say I have anybody who's a very, very close Japanese guy friend. Yeah, it just doesn't work out for me. Even when they're into a lot of the same stuff, it just doesn't, I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but isolation goes deep, and I've heard in the countryside, it's like isolation times four. Again, you're with an elderly population. All the things that they have to do are very elderly. You're not going to be hitting up nightclubs and bars to make friends, especially if you're like fresh out of college, working your first job ever. Probably not a great idea to try and live it up in the nightlife of rural Japan. There's going to be like zero. Maybe you'll have like a Konbini, a 7-Eleven, or a Family Mart. You can hang out in the parking lot. Job possibilities. Job possibilities are very, very, very limited. If you get out there and placed in a job that is in rural Japan, that is English teaching, I would highly suggest that if you know your contract is coming up, you definitely want to look into moving to the city. Because once your contract runs out, or I don't know how many times you get contracts that can renew over and over again, but like I said, even the JET program is limited to 5. I think I could be wrong, and you guys can correct me in the comments below because it always changes a little bit. It may go as long as 7 years now, but at that point, if you're working that same job for 7 years, they consider you too Japanese to be a brand new foreign experience for the Japanese students out there in the countryside, which I kind of understand. I mean, after 7 years, you've definitely probably become very cultured by the Japanese as far as like following the way they live their life. You're going to start to live it that way too, just out of necessity. But yeah, once that contract runs out for English teaching or whatever you're doing out there, you might want to look into where you're going to be living after that, or where you're going to be getting a job after that. You do not want to be jobless in the middle of countryside Japan. That would be a rough spot to be in. Not a lot of places to apply to. So really think about that. Think about what your living situation might be. It's not like the city where you might be able to rent like a hole-in-the-wall apartment for very cheap. You might have to rent an entire house, which is not very cheap. You might have trouble finding a tiny, tiny space to live in. So be very aware of that. Last but not least, and this is one I've actually even heard Japanese people complain about this, like even Japanese people who've tried to get away from wild city life. Like I said, it's ultra fast paced. It never slows down. And they've moved out to the countryside to try and be like, okay, I just want to slow down. I want to maybe start a farm and live like a more simple life. Volunteer work. So once you move out to a rural area, you're part of the community. You're part of a neighborhood. You're part of kind of a collective. All right. And that collective is going to expect you to do the things the collective does. If there's one thing Japan loves, it's collective activities, group activities, team think, team do. They love it, love it, love it. Okay. So there's usually, like, for example, I remember hearing other friends who lived out in rural Japan saying like every 3 months they had to do like a cleanup of like either like a river or like a creek bed or some sort of like road area. They had to go there and do volunteer cleanup, like just pick up trash out of the water or collect it with nets and stuff like that. And some of them thought like, this is great. They're, big into the environment and loved it. But some of them were just like, why the hell do I have to do this? I have nothing to do with the river. I don't live anywhere close to it. Why do I have to go out there and take my weekend, which, sometimes in Japan, you really, especially if you teach like a Saturday school, you don't get like a huge weekend. And they were just really pissed that they'd have to use that last little bit of their weekend to, do a cleanup for something they have nothing to do with, which I can kind of understand. And meetings every month. If you're part of the equivalent to an HOA, a homeowners association, they often have a town hall meeting monthly to talk about problems in the neighborhood. Are crows starting to land on people's lanais? Are there raccoons going through the garbage at night? Now, these may seem like silly things for you to meet about, but for a lot of the elderly out there, this is like the highlight of their month. They go there, they drink tea, they bring manju to munch on, and they'll go really late into the night. And these meetings are, I don't have a nice way to say it, they're boring as hell. Unless you're really, really into these very small micro aspects of life in rural Japan, you're going to be bored out of your mind. So really think about that when you are making a move to Japan. If you are given the option of rural Japan for some place you're going to teach, or some job you're going to work, or some place you're going to live, really realize that some of these things just straight suck. And I remember these were the things that one girl who made the whole blog about living in rural Japan talked about. She said, if I would have moved to the city, I'd still be there 2 years later, but I could barely make it a year. It was so boring. There was just so much nothing to do. I remember it was like a quote from her. So make sure you got a plan. Maybe you already know people out there. Maybe your significant other is moving with you out there and you have connection to her family or his family. Good on you. That's probably a good situation. But otherwise, if you're going out there as a lone star, as a lone rider, really think about what you're getting yourself into. Otherwise, I've been Unrested. If you like what you've seen here, I do all different types of news about moving, living in Japan, politics in Japan, covering multimedia, social media, and all different types of stars, actors, and well-known YouTubers in Japan. My experience comes from 16 years of living in Japan, and even now I travel between Japan and America, running both an English business in Japan and working as an art teacher here in America. If you like what you saw, please think about subscribing or liking or just even commenting for the algorithm. It's all appreciated. Members, I love you a bunch. I'm going to get you some members videos very soon because I have a 3-day weekend now, so I can finally catch up. And those of you who are interested in joining a live stream, tonight we'll be live streaming my original TTRPG known as Void of Crown. If you want to watch that, it's going really well. If you ever wondered what all these drawings are, or like the swords up in the background, different statues and stuff like this, what is that in the background of his videos? The whole world that I've created is what I use to play with my characters online, the people who play the playing characters online. It's my own original TTRPG, tabletop role-playing game. If you'd like to see that and find out more about the art you see behind you, that's your chance to do it. Of course, you can always come on the live stream too and just ask questions about Japan. I'm more than happy to answer them live. and we'll continue to do so with what I call JFAQ, what is Japan's Frequently Asked Questions. And of course, if there's anything you want to hear talked about in future videos, leave it in the comments below. I always love your suggestions. They make great videos. And until next time, I've been Unrested, and I'll talk to you again real soon.